So Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, 31a. The last page in the first set of copies. Count from the top down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 lines from the top of the page. The last 2 words, Rav Nachman. Yeah. Okay, so we're finally coming to a conclusion of this very long. We could put it in parenthesis and like square brackets. It's a kind of digression the Gemara took, having raised the statement from Chanina that the halacha follows Reb Shimon Shizuri. So we've been searching to find a statement that Reb Shimon Shizuri made, of which it hasn't been yet qualified that the halacha follows him, and then we can apply the statement of Reb Chanina to that halacha. So we went through a list, and yesterday we came to the first of 2 statements that Reb Shimon Shizuri made, of which we don't have a definitive halacha yet, and therefore we can apply the words of Chanina to that. Okay? The first one yesterday was with regard to Rabbi Shimon Shizuri defining how we measure the size of a box when impurity, ritual impurity, is transferred, like a pathogen. Yesterday we described it. That's transferred from one object to another. So the object that it's touching has to be a carrier, spiritually speaking, ritually speaking, a carrier of that impurity. And most impurities are only conducted by vessels, utensils. So not a building, but a cup. So the question became, when does a bowl become so big, or a box become so big that it's no longer a utensil, and now it's just a big object? So the measurement was 40 sa. 40 sa is a measurement. 40 sa, it's the measurement of a mikveh, actually. The amount of water in a mikveh is 40 sa. Doesn't matter, the measurement doesn't matter to our discussion, but the point is it's a big measurement. The question was, how do you measure that? Whether you include the size, whether you only measure the volume inside that the box would contain. Do you measure the size of the walls as well? Do you measure the size of the legs that's holding up the box? Do you measure the airspace under the legs? And there Rabbi Shimon Shizuri had a statement in that if the airspace under the box being held up by the legs, right, the legs are propping the box up somewhat, and if there's airspace is less than a tefach, less than a handbreadth, then that space too can be counted as part of the 40 sa to render this item no longer a vessel, no longer a utensil, but now a big, large container. And that's where we applied the statement of Chanina that the halacha follows Shimon Shizuri. Now we have a second option. Okay? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, Ayayin, that we can apply the statement of Rav Chanina that the halacha follows of Shimon Shizuri with respect to the case of wine. It's also related to impurity. And it's also related to this idea of proper methods of conducting impurity, or different items that become conductors of this spiritual pathogen, if you will. It's very hard to properly translate purity and impurity. I'm using this metaphor pathogen, but it's not 100% accurate either. I'm just giving you this idea so that you understand that items can conduct impurity. You know, if a dead body is impure and I touch it, then the impurity transfers to me, and I touch something else that transfers to that thing, and then that thing to that thing. And as it goes along, the degrees of impurity are less because I'm farther removed from the original. But then there are times, as we'll see here, at least rabbinically, where certain items can increase their level of impurity, and it's kind of like a pathogen where, you know, depending on the host, it appears to be stronger or less, worse or better. So I'm just using that as a kind of example so we can imagine it. Even though, of course, this is all spiritual and ritual, not physical. So what's the case with the wine? Just now before we've learned. Rab Meir says, Shemen, oil, tchila la'olam, is always considered a first degree impurity. This is a rabbinic enactment that even if an item is second or third degree removed from the original source of impurity, if that item is wet, it becomes a conductor of a higher degree, and it goes back to a first degree impurity. So even though it itself is 3 degrees removed from the original item, I touched a dead body, which touched something else, which touched something else. But if that item happens to be wet, then it increases itself to a first degree. This is a Rambinic enactment for whatever reason.
So then if somebody touches that wet item, that
he's
was
a second
originally
degree.
First degree, he becomes second
Yeah.
degree. Okay.
Yeah, it becomes second degree, even though it's 4 removed from the original. But because
becomes, or the person who touches it becomes
it becomes a first degree, and then the next person becomes second degree.
Okay.
So says Rabbi Meir that shemen, oil, is considered a liquid, a valid liquid, and therefore tchila la'olam, it would always be a first degree, even if it's been touched by somebody else who's a third degree or a second degree, not a third degree, it's a second degree. So they're qualifying what the definition of a liquid is, and the Meir therefore says oil is a liquid. The Chacham, the sages say, colleagues of Rabbi Meir, afadvash, so too is the case with honey. So honey, at least in this view, is also a liquid, thus rendering whatever item to be a first degree, even though it's somewhat removed from the original place, from the original source of impurity. Right? And this is the question: what's the definition of a liquid? Mm-hmm. Oil, yes, Rabbi Meir says, and the sages say, of course, oil, but even honey. Because honey is less of a liquid, now there's a solid, so one could argue one way or the other, and the sages take the stand that honey is considered a liquid. Rabbi Shimon Shazari says, afayayin, so too with wine. Now wine too is a liquid. So what's the implication? If Rabbi Shimon Shazari says that wine is as well a liquid, the implication is that the first two guys think wine is not a liquid. That's the way the expression that Rabbi Shimon Shazari uses, at least the way Rabbi Shimon Shazari is quoted here, to say, oh, I think that wine is also a liquid. Meaning that the first two guys who said oil and honey don't think wine is a liquid. And that's, of course, challenging. Wine not being a liquid, why would you think a wine's not a liquid? It's the most liquid of liquids you can think, outside of water.
Yeah, it almost has the same,
same texture.
What would you call it, specific?
Same properties, same texture as water. Yes, the Gemara therefore asks, Mechlal, are we implying the Tana Kama, the first two opinions, Savar of the view that Yayin Loi, that wine is not considered a liquid? That could not be the case. Wine is certainly a liquid. So rather, Ema, you must say, Rabbi Shimon Shazari, Omer Yayin. Rabbi Shimon Shazari says wine. Not that Rabbi Shimon Shazari says also wine is a liquid, but that only wine is a liquid. So what emerges is 3 views. Rabbi Shimon Shazari says the only liquid to render some item, to bump it up to first degree, is wine. Or water. That's not in the discussion.
Yeah.
For sure, I think. Rabbi Meir would add oil, and the sages add honey. So those are the 3 opinions. So of this, we might say, so Rav Nachman Yitzchak says that this is the case where Rav Chanina said that the halacha follows Shimon Shazari. This is what he was talking about. He was talking about this case as the definition of liquid, and Rav Chanina is going with the view of Rav Shimon Shazari that only wine is considered a liquid, not oil and not honey. Okay. End of discussion on that issue. But the brackets is not fully closed, so we haven't gone back yet to the halachas of mezuzah and sefer Torah. But we're getting closer. So the Gemara now asks as follows. Well, the Gemara now raises another discussion with respect to Shimon Shazari and the laws of tithe, which we raised at the end of last page. And the Gemara is going to discuss that for a bit, and then the Gemara is going to go back to tefillin and mezuzah and sefer Torah, which is what its original discussion was. So Tanya, we've been taught as follows. Another teaching from Rabbi Shimon Shazari. Rabbi Shimon Shazari said, Pamachas, it happened to me one time, that Nes'aravli Tevel B'chulin. So you'll remember that we talked about this law called Demai. Demai is if someone buys produce from another Jew, but he's not 100% certain that this person took the required tithe. Right? All produce produced in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, is obligated in a certain tithe. 3 of them actually. So you buy it's always the responsibility of the one who grows the produce to give those tithes.
Tithe being like the 10%.
10%. Yeah, there's a whole system of different tithes, different levels. To the Kohen, to the Levi, and then again to the Kohen. A whole system of tithes. Some are 10%, some are more, some are less.
And the Levi to the Kohen.
Yeah,
Tumas Meiser.
Tumas Meiser. So all of that is actually the responsibility of the farmer, the one who's producing the stuff. Now, but the problem is, something that hasn't been tithed from is forbidden for me to eat. So somebody else can fail to do his obligation and give the tithe, but I'm still stuck with the issue that I can't eat the food. So if I bought produce from somebody and I'm not sure if they would have taken their tithe, this is called demai. It's a rabbinic enactment, and when you're not sure if someone else bought the tithe, you take the tithe. But because it's only a rabbinic enactment, in that it's not my obligation, it's the other person's obligation, and it's possible that the other person did take their tithe. So we're lenient on certain scenarios. So this is the case with Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. He had two, let's say barrels or two groups of produce. One set of produce was tevel, meaning demai. One set of produce was he purchased it from someone of whom he's not sure took the requisite tithe, and v'chulin, and it got mixed up with a batch of produce that he did take tithe from. So now he's not sure. So I went to ask Rabbi Tarfon. What's the question? Just take the tithe. So let's just keep the numbers simple. He has 100 units of kosher food that have already been tithed, and 100 units of which he's not sure. The 200 units mixed together. So why not just take 10 units and that's your tithe? What's the problem? Why is he going to ask a question? The problem is that you're not allowed to take tithe from that which is required and relieve yourself of the duty from something which is not required. Meaning to say as follows. Let's just leave the case of Demaya for a second. If I had 2 batches of 100 units that I produced in my own field, right? So, and I took 10% from one batch, right? I couldn't then take another 10% from that same batch and say, oh, this second 10% is going to cover the other bit. That's you don't have to do that. You have to take 10% of that batch. The definition of what a batch is, when a batch starts and ends, is a big discussion. We talked about yesterday the Rosh Hashanah, the day when the breaking point. It's all part of this set of laws that you have to tithe from the actual produce, not from this produce covering that produce. So now here becomes the problem. Here I have one set of produce from which I'm not obligated to take tithe because I've already taken it. Here I have another set of produce of which I might be obligated because I don't know where it came from. So I cannot take my tithe from that which I know for sure is not obligated to exempt me from that which I might be obligated. And that's why he came to ask the question from Rabbi Tarfon. What do I do now? They've been mixed together. So Amarli, Rabbi Tarfon told me, Lech, go out and kach lecha, acquire for yourself, go buy minashuk from the market, meaning buy from another Jewish person, va'aser alav, and use that to take your tithe. What he means is as follows. I cannot take tithe from that which has already been tithed, so it's exempt from any tithe, and use that to cover my obligation on some other tithe. But if I've had 2 sets of produce that are of equal status in their obligation for tithe, then I could cover one from the other. So I have 200 units, right? 100 units I already took my tithe from. The other 100 units, I'm not sure what happened.
And now they're mixed together?
Now they're mixed together. So I go buy a third unit, a third set of 100 units of, or let's say whatever it is, another set of produce, and that produce is also the kind that I'm not sure where it came from. And then I take my tithe from that, and that tithe will cover the part that's mixed in here, because they're the same status.
You have to take double there to cover the one.
I have to take whatever I'm required for the one that I just bought, 10% of what I just bought, and then 10% of the stuff that's in my batch.
That's in doubt.
That's the one that's in doubt, because they're on equal terms.
They have to be the same quantities, right, as that one.
As long as the quantities cover. So in this case,
at least as much as what was.
Yeah, let's say in this case, I would buy 11 units. I could buy 11 units and give the whole thing to tithe. 1 unit for its own self, and the other 10 to cover, or 11.1, whatever it is.
Yeah,
whatever the actual numbers are. But the point is, I can tithe from that I just purchased to cover the ones that I have mixed in here because they're both of the same status. So this was Rav Tarfon's suggestion, Rav Tarfon's ruling, I should say. So the Gemara now explains what his logic is. I'll translate literally, and then I'll explain what he means. Kasavar, Rav Tarfon's of the view, Da'iraisa, that a biblical question, a biblical doubt, beruba batal, is nullified in the majority. V'roiv amei haaretz ma'asim heim, and the majority of uneducated Jews do take their tithe. So let me explain what he means here. The question is, what's the nature of the doubt? I'm not sure if this person took his requisite tithe, but what's the nature of the doubt? And that changes the law. Is the nature of the doubt that it's a 50-50? Or is it a 70-30? So what do I assume?
About the amount taken, or
No, in terms of
the
probability of whether or not it was taken.
Okay.
So let's say there's 100 people in my town of whom I'm not sure. I'm not sure because I think it's a 50-50 chance, or do I say, most of them probably do, but some don't. So it's a 70-30 chance. So it changes the law. Why does it change the law? Because if it's a doubt that's less 50-50 or less, then it's a doubt of a biblical issue, right?
But the law is changing based on your thought.
Well, based on what we assume the reality is.
Right.
It's not my thought. We want to know what the reality is. Is the reality that most of them do take their tithe, or the reality that most of them don't take their tithe? It's a question of what's the reality.
Who makes that determination?
It's a statistical.
Who makes that determination? I would assume that at the time when they made this enactment, they took a consensus of some sort, or they did some research. I don't know. But the question is, what are your findings? So if the findings are, by whatever determination, I'm not sure, it's a good question, but I don't know what they use to determine. But let's say, whatever the method of determination is, if the conclusion is that it's 50-50 or less, then it's a doubt.
Well, don't they count the treasury, maybe?
Each person, treasury of what?
It's not the treasury, it's each coin.
It's very difficult to make such a determination.
Right.
But anyway, if it's 50 or 50 or less, then I'm in doubt of each wheat stock that I buy from the market is a doubt, right? So when I have, let's say, like a pile of stuff, so I can assume kol departish meruba parish, which means whatever I take came from the majority, right? So if you have, don't take this as the actual halacha, but there are scenarios under which if I had 50 pieces of meat stuck in a pile in the middle of the market, right? And there are 10 meat merchants in the market, and 6 of them are kosher and 4 of them are not kosher, and this piece of meat is lying on the floor, I can assume that it's a kosher piece of meat. Why? Because it's called the parish from parish. I would assume that it came from the majority of locations that are available here, right? So if the majority of people don't take their requisite tithe, then I can almost assume that what I'm taking was not tithe, and therefore it's a biblical doubt that makes me obligated, not just because I am 30% not sure, but I'm 70% sure that it wasn't tithed.
Okay, so hang on a second.
And therefore this item isn't rendered batal, isn't rendered nullified by its mixture by the other people who may or may have not taken their tithe.
Okay, so if I'm buying from you
Yeah.
100 units,
Yeah?
but it's your obligation
To take the tithe.
to take the tithe, and you didn't, but I'm not sure.
You're not sure what my status is.
I'm not sure what your status is.
Yeah.
So now I have the 100 units,
Yeah.
and because I'm not sure if you gave,
You take your tithe.
I take my tithe. So now I'm paying for you.
In a sense, yeah. But the question is, the fact that you're taking is only a rabbinic enactment. And the question is, why are you taking that? Are you taking it because you're 70% sure I didn't take it? Or are you taking it because you're 30% sure I didn't take it?
So
Which one is it?
That remedy you suggested, or it was suggested in the Gemara about
Mixing them all
taking
together.
an alternate set,
Yeah.
wouldn't apply if it's a biblical.
Exactly.
Right? Wouldn't apply
So
if it's a biblical doubt.
that's right. It would only apply if you're of the view that the majority of people are taking their tithes, and therefore I can safely assume whatever I'm taking came from the majority, and it probably was tithed anyway, and then I can take from one on the other. Because if one is biblically actual, if the tithe here is being done because if the tithe is being done in such a sense, if I were to assume, right, that the majority of people don't take their tithe, right, then it's almost as if, in a sense, there's an actual biblical obligation to take the tithe on the stuff I purchase, because the statistical probability is that it wasn't tithed. And therefore, this little scheme of taking from one to the other, that wouldn't work. It only works, right? I told you at the beginning that if I had two sets of produce, of which I know I'm biblically obligated on both of them, I have to take from 10% from this one and 10% from that one. I can't take 20% from one to cover both, because they're both biblically obligated, and doesn't have that leniency of taking from one group on the other. The leniency only goes when I'm not biblically obligated. I'm only rabbinically obligated. But I'm only rabbinically obligated if the statistical probability is that the other person took it. If the statistical probability is that he didn't take it, then there's a biblical statistical probability that I have to take my tithe, and therefore I cannot tithe from one group on the other. So from the fact that Rabbi Tarfon told the person that he should take another set, and tithe from this group, exempting his obligation on that group, I can assume that if Tarfon's of the view that the majority of people do take their tithe, and thus it's only a minor rabbinic issue, and therefore I can take from that which I'm not, I can take tithe from that which is biblically exempt on some other set of produce from which I'm biblically exempt. Because it's only a rabbinic issue that they share. Good morning. Clear? Okay. So let's see it again. So Kasavar, if Tarfon's of the view that that when it comes to a biblical issue, Beruba Batal, when the majority of the scenario is one way, I assume all of it is that way. Like the steak. It's nullified in the majority. It's a literal translation. Meaning to say, whatever I have in front of me, I can assume it comes from the majority of cases. And therefore, and in addition, the majority of people, even those that are ignorant and uneducated, do take their tithe. And therefore I could assume, biblically speaking, that what I bought here was tithed. And therefore, Rav Tarfon's suggestion becomes I am tithing from that which is biblically exempt, ala potter on something else that's biblically exempt. And therefore I have this leniency to tithe from one group on another. Because if I had a biblical obligation to tithe on either of these groups, I wouldn't be able to tithe from one group on another. I can only use one group of produce to exempt my obligation on another group if it's a rabbinic one. If it's biblical, it's too stringent and I can't do that. Clear? Okay. The Gemara now asks as follows. Why didn't Reb Tarfon just tell him, go buy your produce from a non-Jew? If I'm of a view, because there is such a view, which says that if you buy produce from a non-Jew in Israel, you still need to take your tithe, even though it came from a non-Jew, at least rabbinically. Why? The logic is that if we allowed for the exemption of tithe when non-Jews purchase, when non-Jews produce produce in Israel, people would sell all their farms to non-Jews to get away with tithing. That's the logic. So if I follow that logic, then I'm also rabbinically obligated to take tithe from a non-Jew. Now, if, as we just described, any time I have two sets of produce, both of which I'm exempt biblically but obligated rabbinically, so why not buy it from a non-Jew, which has the same rabbinic obligation? Therefore, I must say, Kasavar is of the view, the acquisition of a non-Jew of land in Israel does not exempt you from your tithe.
And they have the same biblical stringency.
Then they have the same biblical stringency. Right. So he's taking it even further. Not only am I rabbinically responsible. Right. The logic I just told you before was that if a non-Jew buys the produce, he's biblically exempt. But the sages enacted so that we don't use this loophole, and they said you still have to take tithe from a non-Jew. This view is taking it even further. The fact that he purchased it doesn't even exempt him from the biblical one. Or another way of putting it is, you really are not allowed to sell your land to a non-Jew.
You can't do an end run.
Yeah, you're not allowed to sell your land to a non-Jew. And if you did, it would not exempt you from your tithe, even biblically. And therefore, better buy from a Jew of whom there's a statistical probability that he did take his tithe, thus making it only a rabbinic obligation for me to tithe, and then I can take from one group to exempt another group.
Is this probability based on an individual or a community or both, or how is that? Is it not?
It seems from here that it's universal.
It's a communal.
It seems like it's universal.
statistic.
Yeah, it's a universal statistic at the time of the enactment. Let's put it that way. It's quite possible that over time things would change. I imagine that today, in the same way, you need to have a hechsher, like well, not just I imagine. The reality is that today you have rabbinic supervision, and you have a stamp that says this thing was produced under Jewish law. In Israel, the same thing have to be over here the rabbis have to make sure that the ingredients are all kosher and it's all prepared in a kosher fashion. In Israel, they have to make sure that the requisite tithes were taken. And that's the case. When you go to a restaurant and you see you look at the certificate on the wall, it would say Trumas Samais, the requisite tithes have been taken. So once you're relying on rabbinic supervision, it doesn't matter who you're buying it from, right? You also remember something else. Today with mass production, you don't know where most of your fruits and vegetables came from. You have no idea who the farmer is. Back in the day, you would know exactly who the farmer is. He's your neighbor, right? So we're not going to make you be impolite and start blaming, pointing fingers. This one not is tithing, this one not tithing. So they made some statistical probability. But most of it doesn't apply today because you'd be buying it with a rabbinic supervision given its mass production. You don't know where it came from, who not to rely. You have rabbinic supervision. And once you have rabbinic supervision, you trust them that the tithe was taken.
Where's the truma money going to today? To the rabbinate or?
Today?
You're saying you're
today they still take tithe. I think they burn it, right?
Yeah.
I think they burn it. Yeah.
Truma you can't give to a coin because a coin is not.
Today, no. Yeah, truma has to be eaten with someone who's pure. Nobody today is ritually pure.
So you can't use it.
Also,
If you've been to a hospital, you're ritually impure.
Yeah, and the Meiser Rishon, that's only a monetary obligation that they don't give to the Levi.
I think they burn most of the stuff. The same way with challah. With challah, you take the part of dough from the batch and you burn it.
And the Meiser Sheni you redeem with a coin.
Other things you can redeem
a
it.
large amount, or with a small coin.
Yeah.
Practice. But the truma you're stuck.
Yeah, you have to burn it.
And truma Meiser as well.
Okay, so let's conclude this. So Kasavar is of the reason why he didn't tell him to buy from a non-Jew, because Kasavar is of the view that Ein Kinyan Lo'evet Kechavim B'Eretz Yisrael, the acquisition of a non-Jew of land in Israel does not Lafkia Miyad Meiser does not exempt you from your tithe, and therefore buying produce from a non-Jew still maintains its status of biblical requirement to take the tithe, and thus you can't use that, and therefore you cannot use produce for which I am biblically obligated to take tithe and use that to exempt me from that which I'm only rabbinically required. Okay. There are those, Ikadami says the Gemara, there are those that have this conversation in the exact reverse and taking all of Reb Tarfon's views and flipping them on their head. Right? Because each of the rulings that Reb Tarfon gave, buying it from a Jew which you're not sure about, and not buying it from a non-Jew because buying it from a non-Jew still retains its biblical obligation to take tithe, is all based on these underpinning laws. And if we flip those underpinning laws, then the result changes. So let's see. Ikadami, there are those that say that the whole story was reversed. That Omar later, Reb Tarfon told Reb Shimon Shazuri, when Reb Shimon Shazuri came to him with this dilemma, I have a batch of produce that I took my tithe. I have a batch of produce that's Demai, I bought it from someone who I'm not sure about. The two mixed together. I can't take the tithe from this batch because I would be taking tithe from that which is not obligated and that which is obligated rabbinically. What do? Same scenario. And what he told him was, Lech, go, kach man oived kechavim. Go buy from a non-Jew more produce and use that to give tithe to exempt you from this batch, from this mixed batch. Which means he's of the view, at least in this version, that produce produced by a non-Jew in Israel does not retain biblical obligation, but only retains a rabbinic one. We're flipping it on its head. Kasava, therefore, he's of the view that yesh kinyan lo'evet kechavim b'Eretz Yisrael afkiya miyad ma'aser. A non-Jew, through his acquisition of land in Israel, does exempt you from biblical tithe, but only has a rabbinic tithe. And therefore, and therefore that means I'm taking tithe from this produce that I bought from a non-Jew, of which I'm only obligated rabbinically, to exempt me from the mixture I have here, which I'm only obligated rabbinically. So there are two versions. If you're of the view that buying from a non-Jew is rabbinic, then you could use that to exempt you from your mixture, because the mixture is only a rabbinic issue. But if you're of the view that non-Jewish produce in Israel still retains its biblical requirement, then you cannot use that to exempt you from that which you're only obligated rabbinically. So now the Gemara continues in this version. The lemale, perhaps he should have said to him, Kach mashuk, buy from a Jew. Why didn't he tell him to buy from another Jew that may or may have not taken his tithe, if it's only rabbinic? Therefore, we must say that in this version, Rav Tarfon's of the view that buying from a Jew of whom I'm not sure he took his tithe is biblical. How is it possible that it's biblical in doubt when the doubt is over 50%? That is to say, the majority does not take the requisite tithe. If the majority doesn't take the requisite tithe, then when I buy from a Jew of whom I'm not sure I'm biblically required. So it flips the whole story on its head. So, why didn't tell him to buy from the market, buy from a Jew? Because the Tarfon's of the view, the majority of people do not take their requisite tithe. If that's the case, when you buy from a Jew, you are biblically obligated. And if you're biblically obligated, you can't use that to exempt you from this mixture, which is a rabbinic issue. Okay.
Isn't the qualifying grains here the one that's been mixed together,
Yep,
and not the one that's being
purchased,
used to offset? Which one do you analyze in terms of?
Well, both.
You have to analyze both.
Both, because
not just because I thought you wouldn't have to analyze
the one you're buying.
Let's see, the one you're buying.
Well, both, because when it comes to biblical obligation, I cannot use one batch to exempt me from the other batch.
Yeah.
So if the one in the mixture is biblical, mixture. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. You're right. The one that's in the mixture is actually biblical. In other words,
Right.
if buy from a Jew in the market is biblical, then so is the mixture biblical, and I can't take from one biblical on another biblical.
Okay.
It only works if the mixture there is rabbinic and the mixture there is rabbinic.
So they're both qualifying.
Well, actually, one second. No.
Here the question is something maybe he took and he didn't. Like if you have two batches that are both biblical, be no problem mixing.
Sorry, you're right. If they're both biblical,
they have to be the same level.
Right. But over here, you're right.
Here's a suffix. That's a mix.
Which means, so you're right. So which means that the one that I bought earlier and mixed in is actually a real doubt.
Okay.
Somehow that's actual real doubt, and it's more in doubt than the one I buy from the market, because the one I buy from the market is a statistical probability that it wasn't taken. But for some reason, the one in the batch is the one in the batch is less is in a less certainty that I'm required. First of all, because it was bought on doubt. Number two, because it's mixed. So because it's mixed, it makes it in a lesser statistical probability that I'm required to take, whereas the one I buy from the market is in the higher statistical probability that I should take. And therefore, I can't exempt myself from the one I buy from the market on the one that's there, unless I'm buying it from a non-Jew, in which case there's no doubt to begin with. It's just a straight-up biblical obligation. In this version. All right. Let's conclude this discussion.
But a non-Jew can grow two types of grains in one field, so you never know.
That's not my business, though.
But we're not allowed
That's
to.
not what we're talking
That's not my business now. In other words, it's a separate discussion, not really related to this directly. You're actually allowed to.
Yeah, it's not answered, but
You're not allowed to.
you can't plant it yourself.
You're not allowed to grow and produce a mixture, but if somebody else didn't make a mixture, you're allowed to enjoy it.
Yeah.
I believe we do so.
Yeah.
Isn't that like a grapefruit? Is it a
And
cross
that's
of an
the
orange and a
whole
lemon?
principle of grafting, exactly. We can't graft, but
We're not allowed to graft. Others can graft, and we can.
but if they do graft, the produce is permissible.
Okay, let's just conclude this discussion here. Shalach le Rabbi Meimir bar Shalmei Rav Papa. Rav Yemar son of Shalmei sent the following message to Rav Papa and asked him, Hada Amar Rabbi bar Chanina, that which Rabin son of Chanina Amar Ullah said in the name of Ullah Amar of Chanina in the name of Chanina. That which he said, which Rav Chanina said, Halacha Reb Shimon Shazuri, the halacha follows Reb Shimon Shazuri, which earlier we said applies to the case of the wine or the case of the box. Right? But he didn't, the statement of Rav Chanina didn't end there. He said, moreover, wherever there is a case and Reb Shimon Shazuri is mentioned, halacha k'moisei, the halacha follows him. Right? That was the statement. The statement wasn't just that the halacha follows Shimon Shazuri. That was one half of the statement. And we spent the last week and a half trying to find a scenario that this applies to. And we came to the conclusion that the statement of Chanina, that the halacha follows Shimon Shazuri, applies to the case of the wine or the box. But he also said, Rav Chanina also said, you should know, not just halacha follows Shimon Shazuri in these cases, but actually anytime you find Shimon Shazuri's name, you should follow him. So Rav Yemer asked her Papa, Apen esarev le eteva b'chulin? Does it also apply to this case where Reb Shimon Shazuri went to Reb Tarfon and asked him about this mixture? Because it's not Reb Shimon Shazuri talking. It's Reb Tarfon answering him. It's just Reb Shimon Shazuri bringing the question. So does it apply to this case in whichever version you take? Amar Lei, Rav Papa said, yes, it does apply to this case. And furthermore, Amar Rav Ashi said, Amar li Mar Zutra. Mar Zutra told me, Kashi bar Rab Chanina Mesura. Rab Chanina bar Sura questioned the whole notion of the question. Look at the next page. You want to pass me one? Here, you have the next one here. Sorry. So, Amar Marzutra told me, says Rav Ashi, Kashi bar Rab Chanina Mesura. Rab Chanina bar Sura. Rab Chanina from Sura, which is location, was challenged this whole idea of the question. Pshita. Obviously, Rav Chanina's statement, which said that wherever you find Shimon Shazuri's name, the halacha follows him, applies to this case. Did Rav Chanina say, wherever you see Rav Shimon Shazuri make a statement in our Mishnah, then you follow him? That's not what he said. Ela kol makam sheshana ka'amar. He said, any time where he is mentioned. And since he's mentioned, the halacha follows him. So I don't know if Mar Zutra is telling Rav Ashi, I don't know what Rav Meir was all bothered about. The statement is clear. Wherever Rav Shimon Shazuri's name is found, the halacha follows him. Here Rav Shimon Shazuri's name is found, follow him. Finished. End of story. This finally closes our brackets on the whole issue of Shimon Shazuri. And God willing, tomorrow we get back to the laws of mezuzah, tefillin, and sefer Torah, which is what we began with. So if you will, you can kind of close the square brackets now. Have a wonderful day, everybody.